Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Lean Pub Front Matter podcast. I'm your host, Len Epp. Recently, I had a chance to interview Brad Sams, who amongst his other media roles is a tech journalist known for his Microsoft scoops, and who is the author of a recently published book telling the behind-the-scenes story of the fall and rise of the Microsoft Surface brand, based on over 24 anonymous interviews. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to the podcast and rate and review us in iTunes. It really does help enormously. You can also follow the podcast on Twitter at FrontMatterCast, and if you haven't already, I suggest you check out leanpub.com if you're interested in writing your own book or course. Thanks for listening to this little introduction, and I hope you enjoy the interview. Hi, I'm Len Epp from Lean Pub, and in this Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Brad Sams. Brad is a writer and podcaster and executive editor of both Petri.com, one of the world's leading content resources for IT professionals, and Thurrott.com, the website for the award-winning technology journalist Paul Thurrott. As a tech journalist, he's particularly noted for his knack for breaking stories on Microsoft's upcoming products. To hear Paul's podcast, you can subscribe to the Sams Report as well as the First Ring Daily podcast in iTunes, and you can also subscribe to Brad's popular channel on YouTube. You can follow Brad on Twitter and Instagram at Snap at BDSams, and check out his author page at Thurrott.com. Brad is the author of the book Beneath the Surface, the inside story of how Microsoft overcame a $900 million write-down to become the hero of the PC industry. Based on years of his own research and dozens of anonymous interviews with Microsoft insiders, in the book Brad tells the fascinating story behind the fall and rise of Microsoft's Surface device brand, which had a disastrous launch in 2012 but was turned around and is now a pretty big success, making its story of particular interest to anyone curious about the business behind building and rebuilding brands. In this interview, we're going to talk about Brad's background and career, his work as executive editor for popular tech news websites, his book, and at the end we'll talk a little bit about his experience creating the book. So thank you, Brad, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
Well, thanks for the invite, and that was quite the intro. You definitely did your background and your research, and you got all the enunciations correct. And not everybody can say that they get that right on the first try. So well done, well done.
Thank you very much. I find that there's a sort of positive correlation between the amount of research that you do into an interview and the quality of the interview in the end. So hopefully that works out this way too. I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you made your way into the world of tech journalism.
Yeah, so this is, it's at least to me, it's interesting. I think everybody probably finds some interest in their own journey. Mine started in college. I was poor, like many other college students, right? Trying to pay the bills, trying to figure out just how I'm going to eat and stay above water. And what I got really good at doing in college was building up blogs and then selling backlinks. I was one of those people in college that used to sell backlinks for money. This was before Google did their Panda update, which means that if you had a high page ranked website, you could sell a backlink to somebody for a couple $100 and make some money. And so during my course of earning an accounting degree or bachelor's in accounting, I was running at some point dozens of websites because you would try to build it all the way up to a Google page rank. 4 would be the holy grail. 5 would be a home run. And then sell that link, and that would last for 3 to 4 months, and then Google would kill the site, and then you'd have to try to sell another one. And by doing that, I got really good at a couple things. One, building websites based off of WordPress and hacking that stuff together. And 2, more importantly, how to write about almost anything. I mean, I was writing about hot dog stands in Daytona Beach who wanted better SEO to Cape Cods for sale in New Jersey, like just anything across the board. And so I found another website called neowin.net, and they were writing about Microsoft. And so I started helping them out with some SEO stuff. And that's kind of how I got into the tech journalism world. And I was doing it on the side as I was building up another professional career in accounting and eventually earned my MBA. And at one point, I had an option to make. It's like, am I going to run down this tech journalism route, or am I going to go down my CPA route? And fortunately, I met Paul Thurrott, who I'd known for a couple of years. I met him and another guy in a bar in New York City. And that individual owned a couple tech websites. He said, hey, can you help me come run them? Not only just write, but I need help actually running them. And it was the right time and right place. And I've been doing it for many years now.
And what was your first introduction to blogging about tech specifically?
Well, my very first article article was renewin.net was about 100 gigabyte laptop hard drive. Is the very first thing that I ever wrote about on the internet. It was just I was in the role at that site of here's a press release, Brad. Can you turn it around and write something about it so we can publish it because they're trying to get traffic and they're trying to build things up. But my first, I think, big event that I ever went to was CES, and that was sometime in the mid 2000s.
And I'm curious, I mean, I think a lot of people on the other side of it see people who write about tech as people who sort of, both get some insider information, which is something I want to talk to you about in a little bit. But, this is just a bit cute, but do you get all kinds of cool products and stuff sent to you before they're released?
So yes and no. There was definitely a phase where I was all in on review units, right? It was great getting laptops and phones and all this stuff. And I have tons hanging out and around. Candidly, I've gotten away from that a little bit. The Microsoft hardware, which is how the book started to come about. But at some point, it just jaded with it. Like, here's another laptop with the exact same specs, but one's made by Acer, one's made by Dell, and one's made by Lenovo. And there's just a little few things differently. And I kind of a little tired of writing about that stuff. It's a fun thing to do for a while, but you can definitely kind of get, I don't want to say bored, but there's other challenges out there that I find more enticing than saying, okay, here's a laptop and what's great about it.
I mentioned Petri.com and Thurrott.com in the introduction, but you're actually in charge of more than that through the Blue Whale Web Media Group. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what your larger role is.
Yeah, so our two larger properties are Petri and Thurrott, and Petri is for IT pros and Thurrott is more of the consumer tech channel. But my role sits with BWW Media Group, which is the parent company of those two sites. But there's a lot of other things that we do. We go to events. We've got other kind of sub-brands, if you will. We've got other products. But my role in general is to, one, help define our content strategy to make sure that on the IT pro side that we're writing about the right things like Office 365, Azure, AWS, and all that good stuff. And then on the Thurrott side to make sure that we're staying up with the trends, because consumer tech is very trend heavy. You have products coming out, there's cycles, and making sure that we're always just kind of in a line. And so I write across both properties, but then at the same time, I also go out and quite literally buy content for the Petri side. So we have a team of freelancers who contribute content. And then if there's a new topic coming out, I will go out and try to find somebody to write about it and buy content from them. And then when it comes to design work, it's basically my job in a nutshell is to make sure traffic is coming into the site, whatever that entails. If that's design, if that's content, if that's SEO work, if that's video strategy, if that's going to events, it all kind of falls under where I reside. And then I dole it out to the people as needed to make sure that the two sites are just remaining healthy from a traffic perspective.
And as an influencer, do you find that people try to influence you, specifically companies? Is there a sort of there must be a kind of interesting quality, sort of contacts you would have with PR people?
Yeah, there's this big trend in the industry, and I don't know if it's trend is the right word, but one of the things to exactly what you're talking about is I get emails anytime any sort of event happens in the industry, if it's consumer tech or whatever, I will get random PRs from people saying, hey, would you like a quote from an executive on the topic? And I don't know if anybody ever takes that stuff up, because if I'm going to go out and try to get a quote from somebody on a specific topic, it needs to be somebody that I trust. If it's a security related issue, if it's a VR, AR, whatever, I want to find somebody who is trusted in that industry, not somebody who randomly emails me and says, hey, talk to our executives. What you really see a lot of, at least in my inbox, is there's a lot of PR companies trying to get their brand heard, which granted is their role. But they go about these things the wrong way, in my opinion. Like, if you've never talked to me in my life, and then you email me and saying, hey, can you cover our company? Like, it's not a thing. It should be, it's a relationship. I need to understand why I should cover your company. Granted, everyone's going to say because we have the new hot product, but there's a genuine approach to how stories get written and told and all that stuff. And I can almost guarantee you that it's not from a cold email that comes into somebody's inbox.
Yeah, it's really interesting you bring that up. there's so many ways that people try to get the word out about what they're doing. I mean, startup people tend to probably have more passion than, say, a paid PR person. But establishing that connection with someone is so important. You remind me, I was at a tech conference in Vancouver not too long ago, and there was someone presenting, and he said that every once in a while he gets an email, and he put it up on the screen hiding the person's name, but saying, hi, just following up on my last email, would you like to go out? Would you like to go out for drinks to talk about this? And he sort of went into a voice as though he was responding. And so, oh, sure, just let me call my wife and tell her that I won't be there to pick up the kids tonight. And when she asks why, I'll say, because I'm going for drinks. And when she asks with who, I'll say, I don't know. It's someone who emailed me. It is a really interesting challenge, and I think something that a lot of people who are trying to promote the things that, again, whether they're paid for it or whether they're like genuinely kind of straightforwardly passionate about it, that establishing a real connection with someone is actually way more important than an email blast or something like that.
You're exactly right. And I'm going to butcher the statistic here, but I know it was pretty heavy handed. It was something like 5 or 6 to 1 PR people per tech journalist. So there's the quantity on the PR side is way outweighed by the number of people who actually write about this stuff. And granted, I don't write about everything. I mean, I write a lot about in the IT pro space and the Microsoft space. So it's easier for me to filter things out that if I get something that's like a really like Oracle heavy pitch, it's like, guys, you're not even doing your research about what your point. These people get really kind of aggressive too, where they'll just send you random calendar invites, or they'll change the subject line, which to me is always straight into the trash. Like if it's their first time emailing me and it starts out with RE and then colon to make it look like they responded to an email, like that's not a good a good way to start off a relationship by lying. So it's I don't want it to come off as a complaint, but it's if you're going to pitch someone, do your research and try to be genuine, because that's the best route to go. You can never go wrong doing that.
It's really interesting on the broader issue of trust, attempting to establish a relationship with a journalist or a writer by lying to them from the very beginning seems like a bad strategy. I know that you have had experience in your career with people sending you information and secret information or leaks. I'm really curious as a journalist, how do you establish trust with someone like that? Because you really don't know who they are or whether what they're sending you is real. I imagine you get a kind of like feel for it after a while. But how do you establish trust with someone who's cold emailing you leaks? Yeah,
so it's an interesting topic, because to bluntly answer your question, you never know, right? It's somebody will send you something and they'll be like, look, this is what Microsoft is doing next Tuesday. And if it's their first time ever contacting you, you have absolutely no idea. So the thing then you try to do is you try to go find somebody else who might know and verify the information. That is the absolute easiest way. But that's so much easier on paper than in reality, because if somebody sends me something that hasn't been announced, finding somebody else inside of a company like Microsoft that has 100,000 employees who also knows about that thing that hasn't been announced is tricky. And two, you got to be careful, because if that person has that information, you don't know how widespread it is inside the company. If only 5 people know about it, there's no way I'm going to write about that, because that'll identify who is passing that information along. You got to wait till it reaches a certain level, and then you try to write about it. And there's many different approaches you can take here. But to your point of trying to verify that information, that is probably about half of my job, to be honest. Like I get a lot of different tips and everything else. And what I do is then try to put the puzzle together, right? If somebody says, hey, something's not happening next Tuesday, I don't know what it is, but I know let's just say it's talking about Windows. And I go talk to the Windows people. I'm like, hey, well, what are you guys doing next week? And they might tell me a little bit or something. And it's all just trying to weave these pieces together to understand the narrative that is coming down the pipeline. And every time I publish a scoop or whatever else, it's a risk, because Microsoft changes plans. Just like any company, things get delayed, products get canceled. And so the trick is knowing about something And then the other side of that is knowing when to publish it, because if you publish too early, you might kind of shut off your data stream or your insider info. If you publish it too late, somebody else might get to you. So there's a real sweet spot of, okay, I think this is going to happen on X date. I'm pretty confident of it. This person has leaked me things or sent me things 5 times in a row, and they've all been right. So I'm confident in that. And then it's just trying to align those 3 pillars to publish a really quality story about what's happening in the world.
Pardon the pun, but for the last couple of years, leaks have been in the news as a subject in their own right, thanks to the particular nature of the administration occupying the American White House. And I think that people generally have an understanding of why a culture like the one in the White House is a culture of leaks, because people are kind of jockeying for position, trying to frame the story their own way. And the question I have for you on this topic is, why do people in the tech world leak information?
So I
mean, they might lose their job, they might derail what's going on. Is derailing products partly what they might be trying to do? Are they trying to reposition products and things like that?
So there's a lot of different reasons why things do or do not happen, and there's no way to know why everybody's motive is for what it is. The one thing I do always point out, because Microsoft asks me all this time, they say, why don't you just let us announce it? And I said, well, here's the thing. Every single iPhone since I think the 3GS has leaked, and I think Apple's I think they're doing okay selling iPhones. But what it comes down to is a lot of times that there's engineers who work very hard on a product, and then marketing. Microsoft has a very tough time with communication. They're getting better, but they're still far from good at it. And a lot of times what happens is there's an engineer who's working very passionately on a product, and marketing screws up the announcement, or marketing doesn't position it as it was intended. And so what happens is those engineers, or those people working on the product, they want to get their story out to make it better understood why something is or is not happening, or what's coming down, or what's going on. Other people will know that things are going to leak. One of my bigger scoops in the past, 4 weeks, is that Microsoft is working on an Xbox console that doesn't have a Blu-ray or DVD drive in it. It's called a diskless drive. And one of the reasons why that information was sent to me was that these individuals were afraid that someone else was going to uncover it, because it was in the latest Xbox firmware that you could dig this stuff out if you knew what you were doing. And that it was going to be not positioned correctly, that they didn't want the story to come out that, hey, Microsoft is abandoning Blu-ray and DVDs. They're getting rid of physical media. And so these particular people were scared that narrative was going to run wild, when it is the furthest from the truth. And so everybody has their own motive and reasoning, but a lot of times it's just clarification on things that are happening to make sure the right message goes out, not just a message. Because as a writer, the worst thing that I can do is to get the messaging wrong. If I would have come out and said, hey, Microsoft is dumping DVDs, and here's the proof, that would have been really bad. Microsoft would have got a lot of backlash, and they're not in a position yet to come out and fully refute that at this time. At least they typically don't. And so why people leak things and why people don't, I think it just comes down to they want to make sure that the right narrative is going out, not just a narrative, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and it makes me think of something I hadn't thought of before, but there's sort of competing narratives going on at, say, a tech company like Microsoft, where you have perhaps, very brilliant, hardworking, dedicated engineers for them, their primary audience for the narrative might be other people on the cutting edge of the technology that they're working on, and their interests and the narrative that they're kind of living is very different from the one that, say, marketing would be inhabiting, where they're thinking about, like, how are we going to get this out to consumers, or how are we going to message this for sales into enterprises, whereas the tech guys might be, you totally missed the story, this little innovation that we made was actually groundbreaking. And I can see that if you know that not only that it happened, but that it was groundbreaking in a way that no one who's not an expert in the area would know, you'd really want to get that message.
Yep. And particularly at Microsoft, and I know why they do this, but they are very good at not letting engineers anywhere near the press. It's by design. They keep them kind of behind the curtain, if you will, and which is unfortunate, because those are the guys that have the best stories. And maybe that's why. And there's always some awkwardness, right, to how the sausage is made. But I don't think transparency for a company like Microsoft, especially now that they're supporting open source and they've kind of turned the corner on being this giant in the industry. They're still a giant, don't get me wrong, but I don't think people look at them at like an Amazon or a Google or a Facebook that's going to come and kill every industry. And so these engineers and people behind the curtain have the real insight into the industry, and they never are allowed to come forward with it unless it's in a very particular environment, which doesn't happen often. And so often what you see is that these people just find other ways to communicate to the outside world.
That's really interesting. That touches on a subject that I think a lot of people in the tech world can be preoccupied with from time to time, which is Microsoft's culture. Mm-hmm. I've heard sort of things over the years about Microsoft establishing, amongst sort of developers, a very kind of competitive system where you're sort of in direct, like an antagonistic relationship with your colleagues. And also in a way that Apple ultimately avoided, given I'll call it the legend around Steve Jobs, although there's of course so much truth to it that, he would actually, be involved in things from the smallest details of how products were developed in a way that other executives weren't. And then you've got Microsoft on the other hand with, when I think of Steve Ballmer, for example, I think of a big red-faced loud guy who's very energetic and more like an East Coast, I'll call an East Coast executive than a kind of Silicon Valley Steve Jobs or Elon Musk type guy. I guess that's sort of like very kind of high level, but is that more or less the way that Microsoft was, and has it changed under?
So it has definitely changed. They've changed fundamental philosophies, which is why they got rid of some of there's always this miscommunication that they got rid of all of their software testers. That's not completely true, but it's definitely changed, and it's changed for the better. Under Ballmer and Sinofsky and kind of the previous regime, it was very quiet and isolated development, and everything was done in silos. And don't get me wrong, Microsoft is not a perfect utopia at this point. Compared to where they were 10 years ago, they are in a much better, much more less siloed infrastructure. But there's still some old school guard that goes on and some silos that are still there. But from a cross-org perspective, it is much more friendly to be on, let's say, the OneDrive team and go walk over to the Outlook team and be like, hey, let's build something awesome together, as opposed to a couple years ago where it would have been like, why would we do that? Because our bonuses are only tied to OneDrive performance. Who cares about helping Outlook? And so they have done a good job. They still have ways to go. The other cultural issue that Microsoft is still dealing with, and they haven't figured this out yet, is Microsoft rewards, like most companies, shipping a new product. They don't do a very good job of rewarding people who fix the bugs and make products stable. So there's a lot of let's ship this product and get it out the door because we want the recognition. But then they fall a little flat on saying, okay, these are the guys that are maintaining our OneDrive or SharePoint, and they're making it awesome and stable. And you know what? OneDrive hasn't gone down for a year. Those people don't get the recognition that they do because that's not the culture that Microsoft has developed or has not fully developed yet. And so they're working on it. But that's kind of where we see these awkward Windows 10 builds come out, because it's, hey, let's ship this build, not let's really make it rock solid. Granted, somebody's going to call me out and be like, hey, they are working to make it rock solid because they have to. But the reward emphasis is always on shipping, not repairing, if that makes sense.
It does actually. Because so many LeanPub authors work in tech, a lot of the topics that we discuss on this podcast are related to software and development. And I've interviewed some software testers before, and so the subject has come up of how in, I guess one would say, a sort of conventional development environment in a company, the testing is looked down upon as being, not the kind of high-level work that the ambitious people are doing. And you mentioned that sort of famously Microsoft has actually had a change with respect to that. So it's still not perfect, as you're saying. But can you talk a little bit about that, about the idea that Microsoft got rid of all their testers? What does that...
This idea that if you write the code, you should be able to test the code. That is the basics of what happened. So they had this Windows 10, and they also had this insider program. So the idea was, that if you're writing the code to ship in Windows 10, you should also be able to test that code. And then once you're done testing it, it goes to the Insider program, which Microsoft had. And at its peak, it had about 7 million users testing the latest build of Windows. So it looked great on paper, right? Joe A writes the code. Joe A tests the code. He thinks it's good. It goes out to these massive amounts of insiders just through sheer numbers that operation or whatever, that feature will get triaged. It'll come back to Joe A. He'll fix it, and then it'll ship out to everybody. The big assumption that they made there was that the 7 million people would actually be A, testing that feature, and 2, actually try to test that feature. And so the challenge they're running into now is that they have people coding and testing, but they're not getting that second set of eyes, at a high level. They're not getting that second set of eyes on the product at a level that it needs to be, because an engineer will triage and test something completely different than a consumer will. A consumer will go file, save as. They won't go file, save as while holding down the caps lock key or page, page down or any of those other types of things, or num lock turned on, because that's not what they're innately, accustomed to doing. And so that's been some of the challenge, is that they got rid of this testing layer in hopes that just through odd numbers that they would get that same quality. And they've struggled through that transition. We've seen Microsoft make a lot of different changes, and they're trying, and I think we're going to see more changes in 2019 because of 1809 was the update that came out the second half of this year was a terrible release. And so Microsoft is in this position where I don't think they want to admit that they need that extra layer of testing, but at the same time, Windows for Microsoft isn't a growth product anymore. It's very much, legacy might be too strong of a word, but it's very much a product that is just going to kind of be sustained for a while. There's not going to be 10 million, I should say 10 billion users of Windows 10 anytime soon. It's there. People use it. It's an appliance like your washing machine, and you just need it to work. And so Microsoft is now dealing in that new reality.
I remember when my mom got a Windows 8 computer, I spent an hour trying to do something very simple that one would take for granted in sort of previous versions of Windows. I forget exactly what it was. I would think I was trying to set up a Chromecast or something like that. And it was something about how download. I didn't know where something I downloaded went and couldn't find it. And I'm pretty good with the computer. And I just want to ask you how did Windows 8 happen?
So Windows 8 happened because Windows 7 was so good. And that might be a little glossing over some of the underlying details, but Windows 7 came out and it was rock solid, and pretty quick out of the gate, it was apparent that, hey, this is going to be a long-term OS. People aren't going to want to migrate away from this. And so what they did was they realized that, hey, we have a chance. We have a chance to take a risk with Windows because Windows 7 is so good. And we also know that touch-centric PCs are going to become a thing. They knew that touch interfaces needed to happen, or were going to happen regardless. And so what they were trying to do was they were trying to build two operating systems in one. They wanted something that was good with mouse and keyboard, and they wanted something that was good to touch with your finger. And then they took this idea that this is what we need to do. And then Steven Sinofsky basically siloed off the entire Windows team from the outside world and said, this is how we're going to build it, and it's this way or the highway. And so they didn't get enough feedback. They didn't get enough true testing, and they were pretty much running with fingers in their ears and saying, this is how it's going to be. This is the future. And you got to remember, this is a period of time, granted, at the end of the cycle, when Microsoft just kind of ruled the world. If they wanted to go into a market, they could just walk into it. Their smartphones were still doing pretty well with Windows Mobile. Granted, there was these new challengers called iOS and Android, but Windows Mobile was still a thing. When they wanted to go into the gaming console world, they just walked in with an Xbox, and now they own part of the market. And so they kind of had this heads down approach that, hey, we can tell the world what it needs rather than react to and listen to. And so you put all this together, and you put together some leadership who thought they had all the answers and that they were the best thing in the world. And out comes Windows 8, and it flops in just dramatic fashion. And it was known very quickly, within weeks at a time, that this was going to be a huge disaster. And then we see a couple executives leave the company. We see a turning of the ship. And then, Microsoft is where it is at today.
I've got a question about that. Sorry to interrupt, but it's something that I think as just a sort of normal person on the outside looking at these giant famous companies, and you see people who get elevated within them appear to have a sense of their own personal importance and sway, and they can be completely on the wrong track and make disastrous decisions. They can be sort of walking on clouds and ordering people around, to put it crudely, for years, like they're the greatest thing since sliced bread. And the whole time they're completely wrong about what they're doing in a very obvious way. The question I have is, do you think that when people like that create a disaster like Windows 8, where even like a sophisticated user is just shouting at it all the time, do they internalize that? Or do they move on to the next thing? Or do they just shove it down and repress it?
So in the case of Windows 8, I think they just shoved it down, candidly. I remember in those early days writing feedback thinking like, this is a little too aggressive. I mean, they removed the start button from Windows, which has been the most iconic and most stable thing since 95. And when you take that away, and the other massive blunder, which again was, they thought that they had such an intuitive OS that they didn't put in Windows 8 what is called an out-of-box experience, or OOBE, which is you start up Windows and it kind of tells you how to use it. And when you looked at Windows 8, there was no start button. What you're supposed to do is just move your mouse into a corner, and then this thing would appear, and then it would work. But there was no way to educate.
Oh, God, I'm getting flashbacks.
Yeah, there was no way to educate the user. And so for the technical people, they could eventually figure it out. But to the person who walks into Best Buy and says, I'm going to buy that $499 Lenovo laptop, and then they're presented with this thing and they're looking at it going, where's the start button? Where are all my apps? What is this store thing now that doesn't have any apps in it? And it was a perfect disaster of everything you shouldn't do during software development of an operating system, all just colliding at a time in history where Microsoft was getting pressure from these new smartphone companies like Apple and Google. I mean, Apple and Google weren't new, but their new iOS and Android were relatively new. And Microsoft just had this perfect recipe for a disaster of an operating system. And it hurt hard because they were coming off of Vista, which Vista was a technical disaster from an underlying infrastructure perspective, but not from a usability perspective. Windows 8 was the opposite. It was underneath the hood. It was actually okay. But from a usability perspective, it was a complete train wreck. And that's what sank it. And it ultimately cost Sinofsky and eventually Steve Ballmer his job.
I have a couple of selfish questions that I'd like to ask you.
Sure.
One of which is, I used to work in investment banking, and in my time as an analyst, I did a lot of pretty complex stuff in Excel, which is a world-changing product, very amazing. Yeah. It's 2018, and I have an iMac Pro, and Excel is still kind of laggy on it and forces me to enable macros every time I open it. Why does Excel still not really work on Apple products?
So that's a very large question for somebody who works on that team. But I pretty candidly, well, the macro question is easy because that's a virus thing. That's legacy from Windows. You used to be able to inject things into macro. I guess you still can inject things into macros and just totally corrupt the system. Granted, I don't think Windows is going to fall for that anymore, but that's where that enable macros functionality comes from, because you have to enable that core functionality in the OS and all that other fun stuff. The reason why it's still laggy on OS or Mac OS now is I believe it's still a port. I don't know if they've gone the full native app route yet on Mac OS, and I could be completely wrong on that, but I knew for a while it was a really laggy piece of junk. Mostly because of that. And I fully agree that Excel is kind of the root of the Office suite. If Microsoft ever loses Excel, like if somebody comes out with a better Excel, they will be in some serious trouble because that is the stickiest thing that they do. I mean, I use Excel all the time, pivot tables and VLOOKUPs and all that, and every day. And yeah,
it's really interesting. It seems like, I mean, I guess from my perspective, having been a sort of a not just a power user, but like, I did things where like, if I made a mistake, that could have repercussions in the tens of millions of dollars. I mean, it would never actually result in a kind of loss, but like things could be misrepresented to that extent. Let's put it that way. If you're working on a multi-billion-dollar transaction or something like that, and when you're using Excel, you want it to be a tool like a hammer. You know, you don't want to be thinking about the tool. You want to be thinking about what you're doing, and even the slightest messing around with that actually is a difference in kind rather than degree. And so I noticed that this was a couple of years ago. It's not true of the latest version of Excel, but I think it was Excel 2011 or something like that. I got it for an Apple, for the Mac OS. And when you would click the right arrow or the left arrow to move from cell to cell, there was a little pause, a little animation of that movement. And I was like, I mean, to people listening, this might sound like really particular, but like that destroyed Excel. That one little decision actually made it not the product that it was anymore. And how, I guess the question I would have is if you have any insight into this, how could a decision like that be made? I mean, are the people who are working on this core product not really using it in their own professional lives?
That's a very good question, but I know the animation you're talking about. It was like a smooth transition animation. And it was, I remember when that rolled out because I wasn't quite doing what I'm doing exactly right now. But I remember when that animation rolled out because I was in the finance world like yourself and everyone complaining because it took just fractions of a second longer to move a cell. But when you have a spreadsheet and you're living in that stuff adds up. To answer your question, are people using the product that they're shipping? They are a lot more now. I don't think you're too far off that many years ago, you could be building things for Excel and you could build new features like tables and whatever and functions, and you would use it once, make sure it works, and then ship it. I think they've rectified a lot of that stuff and they've gotten much better at listening to feedback, which is why that animation is no longer in that product.
Yeah, thank goodness. It's interesting. I mean, just to sort of, I mean, this is very much in the weeds, but like the work that people are doing using Excel is often very important and very directly related to money. And you know, like things where like a mistake can lose you your job or lose you that promotion or lose you that sale or whatever. And there's just a really deep question about the mindset that people have when they're designing things that I find fascinating. So people will do things to try and make a more delightful experience. Yep. And it's like, I don't need an LED light flashing every time I hit a nail with my hammer. You know, I'm not looking for a delightful experience. There's a payment service that we use through LeanPub, which I won't name because I like it and in many ways it's very good. But not too long ago, when you went to make a payment, it started serving up circle faces to you randomly. And I was like, this product has obviously been redesigned by someone who was never in a situation where, like, if they made a mistake sending $25, they didn't have another $25.
Yeah.
Do you see this happening? I mean, I was in preparation for this podcast. I watched a couple of your episodes with Paul. And you guys would actually go into details about how, you know, like when you press escape to leave a message in, I think, Outlook or something like that, it doesn't put you back where you should go. Is this how can a giant company solve this problem where sort of design trends in the sort of meta level of design end up screwing up the actual use of products?
Yeah, that's a great question, because if you can solve it, you can make a bunch of money just doing pitches and walking into corporate offices. I think the thing that Microsoft and any other company needs to understand is they have to listen to the user. The user is where the bills get paid. And if a user isn't complaining about the UI, granted, I know that there's things that companies like to do because they want every product to match. They want it all to look the same. Microsoft's going through this kind of fluent transition design language update. But at the same time, I think Steve Jobs was known, there's a famous quote of saying that he knew what people wanted before they did, which is, you know, that's a pretty ambitious statement. And that's one thing to do if you're launching a brand new product, like if you're launching an Apple Watch or whatever, you're creating something from scratch. When you're massaging something that already exists and you have a massive user base, you have to be very careful about making any fundamental changes to how the product works, not just how it looks, but this is how we end up with that Excel awkward transition between cells that slowed everybody down. And Microsoft quickly walked back on it, thankfully. But I think when you get away from listening to your customer, that is when you start potentially heading down the wrong path when you're updating a product.
Yeah, thanks for that great answer. That's I think that's spot on. And one of the things I like about your writing and podcasts and things that I've listened to is you often take into account the sort of larger context, including the internal battles that are being fought at companies that can actually have a huge impact on what happens. My second selfish question is not my own. It's from my co-founder, Peter. He wants to ask you if you think Microsoft will ever make an Xbox phone so he can have Halo in his pocket. For him, this idea of an Xbox phone that would be, say, twice as thick as an iPhone and with kick-ass games, with a free mobile version of every Xbox One game you own on it. Is that something that you think Microsoft would ever do? And I mean, maybe it's something that you've actually written about. I don't know, but my co-founder.
Yeah, so we have good news for Peter. He will be able to play Halo or I shouldn't say any, but he will be able to play Xbox games in his pocket. And that Microsoft is working on this. It's actually it's part of the Xbox Scarlet update, which is coming in 2020. Now, it's not exactly an Xbox phone. What Microsoft is working on is called xCloud. They announced that name publicly a couple months ago. But what this does is it allows you to stream games. Microsoft is literally building data centers full of Xbox hardware or Xbox-like hardware. And what it will do is any device that has a screen, you will be able to stream games and play them on that display. Microsoft already offers this a little bit. If you have an Xbox and Windows 10, you can stream your Xbox to anywhere you have a Windows 10 PC right now, and you can play on that device. And so what they're doing is making this available across the internet. So will Peter be able to play Halo or other games on his phone? Yeah, he will. What we don't know yet, and this is what Microsoft's big breakthrough is how is that latency going to impact performance? Microsoft says they think they figured it out, and we're waiting to see how that materializes here, which we should start to see actually next year is when they're going to start entering some private testing of it, and then eventually in 2020 it'll be more broadly available. So Peter, you'll eventually get to do it. It's just not going to happen today.
That's fascinating. Thanks. I hadn't heard anything about that. That's so interesting. So my last question before we go on to talk about your book is, what do you think is the best thing that Satya Nadella has done since he's taken over Microsoft?
Well, it depends on who you ask. The best thing he's done is Satya Nadella and Amy Hood gets credit for this, is turning around their stock price. It was stuck between roughly $25 and $35 for about a decade. And right now it's somewhere over $100. So depending on what side of the coin you're on, quite literally, some people might say the stock price. But I think what Satya has done is he's changed the internal culture. And I think that is probably the most important thing. He's helped the company. Before Satya became the CEO, he helped launch Azure, which is Microsoft cloud service. That's how he got kind of popular inside the company. And so he understands what Microsoft's role in the world is. And once it became clear that Microsoft is a productivity company, granted, Xbox is a little out there, but Xbox is doing pretty well. Same with Surface, but they are a productivity company. And once he aligned on that topic and got other people to buy in, he was able to help change the culture more from this like, oh gosh, we're doom and gloom, we're Microsoft, we're just going to kind of eat things and just be like this big ogre walking through, to making people actually want to work there again. And so if you boil it down to one thing, he's been able to shift how people think about working at Microsoft. And I don't want to say he's made the company cool again, because they tried to, quite literally, that's what their marching orders were, make Microsoft cool. But he's helped Microsoft find a purpose in the new world of cloud tech and productivity. Yeah,
thanks for that. That's very convincing. And it is amazing looking at Microsoft's stock price and what's happened since Nadella took over. It's quite incredible. Mm-hmm. As I think you've written about, Wall Street is on his side. So going back to former Microsoft leaders, and moving on to the subject of your book, Beneath the Surface, you write about how Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer fought over Microsoft moving into hardware. And I think that this might be the right place to start when we're talking about the Surface. What was the nature of who was on which side in that argument?
So moving back even further, when Microsoft was starting to work and build an interface that needed a mouse, Microsoft kind of was there and says, and Bill Gates didn't think that Microsoft should take that risk and that they should just give money to Destiny. And so Bill Gates didn't want to build this. Steve Ballmer did. The board eventually the board obviously sided with Steve Ballmer, and they decided to build this thing. And that's kind of it was a very heated conversation because you got to remember at that point in time, Microsoft was basically the provider of the software, and then their OEMs did everything. And Bill Gates' argument was that we're going to upset our partners. They're going to leave us and do something else. And then we're going to be out of luck with our dominant position in the market if we start building our own hardware.
Yeah, that's really interesting. OEM is original equipment manufacturer, and that was something that I totally didn't appreciate until I read your book about how important those relationships are for a company where, so if Microsoft goes into a certain area that its original equipment manufacturers see themselves in, then it starts to become a competitor. And this was actually one of the reasons that Ballmer wanted to insert himself into the launch of the Surface. And so, if I understand it correctly, and in order to sort of be reassuring to all these OEMs that Microsoft relied on and who in turn relied on Microsoft. And so the Surface itself, can you talk a little bit about what it was, what the idea was for the Surface at the beginning? I believe it began life as a $10,000 table. Yeah,
so the Surface brand got started as quite literally a table. A guy named Stevie Batish was working on this thing, and it was conceptualized as a product that was going to blend the physical and digital world. And so it was this really large, expensive table, and it ran this custom OS. And Surface, what you could do is you could go up and take your phone and put it on there, and then it would recognize that it was a phone, and you could transfer photos, and you could put your keys down there on it, and it would recognize that it was a set of keys, and that it would say, okay, Brad's home. That means I can turn the lights on and unlock the doors or do whatever. That's how the product, the brand got started. Microsoft ended up kind of killing that product line. They built 2 iterations of these tables. And then it was during that second iteration of the table that they said, hey, we're going to start building tablets. And they needed a brand name. And they already had the brand name Surface, which made things a lot easier because they didn't have to go after trademarks and create all that paperwork. And so they went from table to tablet, essentially. And then the brand just kind of I don't want to say caught fire because it definitely didn't at first, but the rest is a kind of history there.
And if I understand correctly, the name Surface came from, I think, an observation Bill Gates made about how every surface in the future was essentially going to be a kind of computer.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Bill Gates used to create these things, or he still does. I think he calls them Gates Notes, but he now does it from a philanthropic perspective. But inside the company, he used to write these notes about where he thought computing was going. And in one of them, he said, everything you touch will eventually be a computer or a surface where you can compute. And so that's how they started to kind of come up with this name. And they floated around at a couple ideas way back then. But Surface, because it was available, made the perfect sense. And it was already in this note. And they had the ability to trademark it. And so they ran with it.
And so they decided to build this new type of product, changing the way we interact with the intention of sort of changing the way we interact with things, or at least being ahead of their competitors and sort of understanding that this is where the future was going to go. And it was an incredibly secret project internally. And they had what you refer to, or I presume it was their term, but a tenting process for getting into the Surface hardware project. And I was wondering if you could explain to people a little bit about that. How do you guard secrets within your own company from other people?
Yeah, so tenting at Microsoft kind of refers to paperwork, if you will. And when they were trying to build out these products, it was under complete secrecy. The employees who were working on it weren't allowed to talk about it. And so what Microsoft would do is if you wanted to work on the product, or if you were allowed to work on it, whatever terminology you want to use, they would put you through kind of a process that they call tenting, which is where you go through some interviews, you talk to people about how to keep things secure and private, and the responsibility you had for working on the project, and had to sign a bunch of documents. There was an urban myth, if you will, on Microsoft campus that at some point, if you reach like the highest or the lowest level of tenting to be able to see everything, you have to talk to a former CIA guy, although nobody could ever confirm that. And the whole idea was to essentially kind of scare the individual from talking about these products outside the confines of work.
Yeah, that's really interesting. When I was reading that section of your book, it reminded me I had some corporate secrecy training back in my days in finance, and the story they used to scare us was a guy was in a bar in London once, and he said, "I'm going to Copenhagen tomorrow," to his friend. And the next day, in like the FT or whatever it was, it said, Macquarie's buying the airport in Denmark. Yep. And that story worked really well. It conveyed to you the fact that there could be a journalist, maybe like you, sitting next to you at the bar who knows exactly who you are and exactly what division you work in. And, it can be the most minor of things can actually, to someone who's knowledgeable, it can get the secret out. But I guess the sort of more specific question I have is, but internally though, why would it be so important to keep this secret? Let's put leaks into like bracket leaks for a bit. Mm-hmm. Why would it be so important that some Microsoft employees know what's going on and others don't?
So there's the biggest challenge was at first keeping the message to OEMs correct, right? They didn't want this thing to come out that Microsoft was building a tablet, and then they didn't want OEM partners to like pick up the phone and call Ballmer at the time, be like, "What do you mean you're building a tablet? That's our space. You can't do that." And so they wanted to keep the message correct and make sure that when it was ready and announced that they had all their ducks in a row and that everything went perfectly and that nobody would walk away angry was kind of the idea. The other side of it, too, was that this was a brand new project for a brand new operating system, and they weren't quite sure what they were doing, right? They had a lot of different ideas. They didn't know what was going to make it. They didn't want people in the outside world finding out about it because Sinofsky was so convinced that he had the perfect idea that he didn't need that outside support. So he created this silo. He locked everyone in, and people just became real secretive. And this is one of the primary problems with Microsoft, at least at the time, was that everyone was thinking about me rather than us. And that's what kind of led to this disaster of hardware not being ready, or hardware mostly being ready, I should say, and the software not being ready. And then you have software that's suddenly not ready, but then it's a terrible experience because everybody was so focused on their particular job and not the overall mission, primarily because of these lock-ins of people only working on specific projects. And why they felt the overall need to lock everyone in like this, there's varying theories, but I really think it just comes down to Sinofsky thinking that he had the right idea. He didn't want anyone else to get credit for it, and he's going to build this thing in absolute secrecy and surprise the world.
And who is Sinofsky, and how did he get this into this position where he could do something like that within a company like Microsoft?
Yeah, so Steven Sinofsky started he started before then, but he kind of came to notoriety working on Office. If you remember, the ribbon was a big deal when Microsoft changed the UI of Office. Yeah. I think it was 07 or sometime around then. And he was part of the team that created the ribbon. He was real controlling over that experience, and it went pretty well once people got adopted to it. And so after working on that, he was in charge of Windows 7, essentially. Vista was all screwed up, and he was on the team to help fix Windows from going from Vista to 7. And to his credit, he did do a good job there. And so because I think he did such a good job with 7 that he had this, okay, I absolutely know how the market works now mentality, and then just went all in on Windows 8. And unfortunately for him, his legacy involves Windows 8. Most people don't think about the things he did before then that were good, but it really does end up with Windows 8, and that's how kind of he got into that role.
Boy, it's so easy to shit on things that other people do, but I fucking hate it. It's one of those things. It's like that little animation, you would never invent that if you actually used it the way people use it to do serious work. But sorry. So anyway, I guess I've got to say, I sort of, that guy ruined a lot of people's productivity experiences as Microsoft describes them by building that ribbon. So I'm glad he got a little bit of a calm down. Sorry, that's mean. But anyway, so I mean, we've been sort of dancing around a little bit, but then so the first version of the Surface tablet bombed. Why did it bomb?
I mean, so it bombed because it wasn't ready. The OS wasn't ready. The hardware was okay, if you will. I mean, there weren't too many. I mean, there were definitely early teething issues, but nothing like later that happened with like the Surface Book or anything. But the OS just was not ready. It ran a version called Windows RT, the first version. Granted, Microsoft wanted to ship both products in October of that year, but they had to delay the more classic Surface Pro that we know now by 3 months. So the first version they launched was Surface RT, which ran a version of Windows that looked like Windows. It acted like Windows, but the problem was that it couldn't run applications downloaded from the web. It could only run applications from the store. And at that time, anemic is probably not even doing justice that the app selection in the store. I mean, it was terrible. And so consumers would go to the store, and employees wouldn't quite understand. They'd be like, yeah, this is running Windows. You can grab it. So they grab this tablet and they go to the home and they would type Chrome into their search browser. They download Chrome and they would say, hey, this can't run Chrome. And so then the user would be confused and they could only run apps basically blessed by Microsoft at that point. And that's primarily why it bombed, is the OS just came up so short and was so confusing. I mean, you can imagine opening this thing up and not seeing a start button. You're thinking, okay, maybe I can get through this, maybe whatever, I'll figure it out. And then you can't install Chrome. And then you're like, what do you mean? Like the two things that I know about Windows, I can't do. And so people were very frustrated with it, and it had a very high return rate. And Microsoft ended up having 3 million of these things in inventory when they did a $900 million write-down in June the following year.
And what happened to all
So they did sell them, surprisingly. They sold every single one. Now, they did not sell them for the original price point. Some of them went for as cheap as $99. But the biggest day that Microsoft sold these things was a year later on Black Friday at Best Buy. They sold 240,000 of them in a single day, but I believe it was for a $199 price point. So they did sell them. They didn't dump any of them in the bins by any means, but it was a very big learning lesson. There's a quote by Steve Ballmer that said when somebody asked about how many they should build, he said, we either built enough or not enough, or maybe it was too many. And obviously we know the answer now is that they built too many.
And so in spite of this disaster, the Surface still had internal supporters who won a battle to keep it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so you launched this product, and fortunately, Microsoft isolated Surface a bit from the rest of the company. Not fully, but the idea was that Surface could exist and fail on its own and not sync Microsoft. And so when they set out to build this stuff, Panos Panay, who is the leader of the Surface hardware team, he wanted to build 3 iterations. He thought in his mind that it would take 3 iterations to build something that consumers would love and follow and use every day. And so that was kind of the marching orders. When they shipped the first Surface RT, they were already about 6 months of development into Surface RT2, which means that they were going to build the second generation no matter what happened to the first. And that was kind of the struggle a little bit. It was like, oh, my God, you guys did a $900 million write down, but they're Microsoft. They can't throw in the towel. They were just they weren't sure where their place in the market was yet. And so they couldn't give up. And so they just put their head down and kept charging forward. And they took a lot of flack, and they took a couple black eyes. But by the time they got to the third iteration, when their back was against the wall, they finally shipped a product that did pretty dang well for the company in retrospective comparison.
And how would you characterize the Surface's position in the market now for tablets? I know you've written recently about how the company behind the LSAT test has recently chosen the Surface as its sort of delivery mechanism for its test going forward. So it's trusted. And
yeah. So what Microsoft set out to do from day one was to build the premium brand in the PC industry. Up until the Surface release, if you wanted to buy a high-end PC, a high-end laptop from whatever company. The problem was that company would make a $3,000 laptop, and they were also selling a $400 laptop. There was no truly premium brand. They wanted to be the Apple of the PC world, and it took them a long time. And you could argue that they're not fully there yet, but I do think that a lot of people now cross-shop, say, a MacBook Pro with a Surface Book. They may not buy the Surface Book, but they're at least looking at them in the same light. And that was what Microsoft was trying to do, was to build the premium brand, which is why you always see that their price points are a little bit higher than their OEM partners, which is by design. Microsoft will go into a market and make the top end. That is their goal, is to make the most expensive product in that category. And we've seen it with the laptops. We've seen it with tablets. We've seen it with their all-in-one that starts at like $3,200 now. That is where they want to be. It took them 3 years to get there and a couple massive incidents along the way, but that is what they want to be seen as. And this LSAT was a massive win for the company. I believe they sold 40,000 of them, or I should say are going to sell 40,000 of them over the term of the contract to LSAT.
Yeah, that's just amazing. Someone's going to have a good Christmas bonus.
Oh yeah.
So thanks a lot for that story. It's just so fascinating to see how these huge developments happen within companies, mm-hmm. momentum they get, and where they go.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun to write.
Yeah, actually, so I've got a question about that. So you, just before we move on to the next part of the podcast, and I should say, given how long we've been talking, the last part of the podcast, where I'll talk to you about the process of writing the book. Mm-hmm. So you had about a couple of dozen contacts that all gave you information anonymously. How did you develop that network of people?
So that network was developed over about 10 years. And so some of the people had moved on. Some of the people were still at Microsoft. And I'm a big believer that you shouldn't burn a bridge, right? I'm a very outgoing, positive, try to be generally nice human. And so I had the idea to write this book, let's say March, sometime around then. And one of the first things I had to do was make sure I had enough understanding of the content, which I felt like I did, and I organized some notes and whatnot. And then what I started doing was just firing out messages to people who had talked to me over the years. And there were people I had not talked to in 8+ years. And they were all very happy to try to help me, obviously anonymously, because it could impact their career if their names were tied to this stuff. So that was a big step, was saying, okay, this is anonymous. I promise to keep your information private. But there were a lot of people who said no. Steven Sinofsky did not want to talk to me. I thought maybe he would, because this is kind of his to get it started, but he was very much against the idea of talking to me, which that's fine. That's his prerogative. But it was just calling on old friends and current friends and being like, look, I want to tell this story. Can you help me make sure it's right? And a lot of people were very forthcoming and very candid. And I did my best to try to craft the narrative in a way that showed what was actually happening, which, you know, if you had a bent against Microsoft, you very easily could have turned this into, hey, they just got lucky. But I don't think they had luck on their side. I would say it was probably about 30% luck, 70% just ambition to get to where they are today.
And so why did you decide to self-publish this book?
Yeah, so there was a lot of thought and challenges with this. One, Blue Whale Web Media Group is a publishing company, right? At the end of the day, we publish things not in book form, but we wanted to explore this idea. It's like, okay, can we actually create a book? And candidly, it was pretty much all me. I mean, not a big surprise. I'm a very self-motivated upstart person, just kind of cut my own way through the forest type thing. And so I did approach a couple brokers, and the deals that we were getting or being offered or even just loosely talked about weren't all that great. Typically what happens is they want to buy the rights to the book for some amount of money, and then you get a royalty for each book sold. And some of the royalties were $1 per book sold, and they give you, a few thousands up to $10,000 up front or whatever the deal may be. And knowing the reach that my company has, Blue Web Media Group, and knowing how much personal reach I have, because I have a lot of friends in the industry, I just kind of went with it. I had lunch with a friend who had written a book before, and he looked at me and he's like, candidly, he's like, the holy grail of book sales, physical book sales, is getting into an airport. that is where you want your book to be, because a lot of people will just grab them to read on a plane. And he goes, when was the last time you walked into a bookstore? And that kind of just resonated. It's like, okay, I don't go into Barnes and Nobles anymore. I read a lot of books, but a lot of them are in Kindle or through LeanPub or whatever. There's a lot of digital formats. And so the idea to self-publish just kind of just fell into my lap. Of course, we had to do the physical side. So figuring out that logistics was a challenge. But so far, I think it's been the right decision. I mean, the book is selling pretty well across the different venues that it's out and available in. And we had some really strong days the first couple of days with the physical side as well. And the physical book's only been available for about a week, maybe a little bit longer. And in the world that we live in today, digital distribution is pretty easy. You can figure that stuff out. And when I figured that most people would buy it digitally, I was like, well, what am I paying a traditional publisher for? You're paying for distribution and you're paying for PR. I didn't need help with the PR side. I can do all that. And I very much believe I successfully did it very well on the day of availability. The distribution side, I could have used some help with, but we figured it out, and I think we're doing okay. And I wouldn't hesitate anyone else who thinks they have a good idea, and as long as you have the ability to do the marketing side, to take a stab at trying to self-publish, because it's not as scary. And this is easy to say being on the backside of it now. It's not as scary as you would think. It takes time, and you're going to have some late nights, but it's definitely possible.
And why did you choose LeanPub to write the book and produce the ebook and then presumably the print-ready kind of PDF output that you would use to get it into print on Amazon?
So here's the problem I was looking to solve. I knew how to write. I'm a writer. I understand how to write. I don't understand how to make an ebook. I didn't understand at that time how you take text and turn it into a digestible EPUB format. And so it was, okay, what tools are available? There are a lot of tools out there that allow you to do this, and everyone should do their own research and approach it your own way. But for me, it was, okay, LeanPub is there. I had known other people who had used it, and it was relatively simple. You just go and sign up, and then you guys present a series of options, such as writing in the browser, the Dropbox, Google Docs now. And so it was just kind of, okay, here's a turnkey solution that I think that I can work with. And so I just went down that route because it seemed to be the product that fit my needs for getting an EPUB file that I could then distribute on my own, or through your store or through Amazon. And it was a relatively easy process in the end. There were definitely some teething issues along the way. When you talk to Peter next, I think I emailed Peter probably 24 times, but the end product has been perfect's probably an inaccurate word, mostly because I know there's some grammar issues and I still got to fix them. But it got me to a place where I can sell this thing and feel good about it. And, I wouldn't hesitate to tell other people to approach LeanPub candidly. There are some caveats that I think everyone should be aware of, but there's also some great features, such as that export to print saved me so much time that I can't really imagine how I would have done it any other way and got the book shipped on time.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You mentioned the 24 emails. So just by coincidence, the last interview I did for this podcast was the first with an author who used LeanPub to create online courses, which you can do on LeanPub now. And you're actually the first author I've ever interviewed for this podcast who used our Google Docs workflow. It's very new, but you were a great first customer to have, partly because, obviously you're a writer and you know that side of things, but all those emails helped us get the Google Docs workflow in shape for everyone else, for you and for everyone else going forward.
Yeah.
So thanks very much for every single one of those emails. They helped us. They helped us a lot, and now it's actually pretty solid.
I was going to say it was because what I started to do was I wrote it in the browser, and then I emailed Peter and said, hey, I think it was Peter. Maybe it might have just been your generic help desk. And they said, hey, go use Google Docs. And so I transformed it all over. And you're right. The early days were very rough. But I have a background. I used to do some C++ programming, and I had some time on my side. So I tried the best of my ability. I know some of them were probably me late at night and getting a little frustrated with just life in general, being like, why isn't this working? But through the stages of it, where it's at today, I would feel reasonably comfortable saying, okay, go use Google Docs, because now it's a pretty good workflow. It was it was a little challenging to get there at times, but by the end of the book, there's no major hurdles, I think, at this point anymore.
Yeah, the thing. I guess actually one question I have is why did you want to? I mean, we recommended it because given our understanding of what you were up to, it seemed appropriate. Do you know? I'm sorry, this is a very in the weeds customer development kind of question, but like, do you use Google Docs?
No, see that's one of the things that kind of pushed me towards it. Mostly because this book is about Microsoft. A lot of things we do is about Microsoft, and I know that there's people out there that love Google Docs. And when I saw that you guys had this option, I figured, what better way to familiarize myself with Google Docs and the workflow than to actually do a large scale project inside of Google Docs. And it's not quite as good as Office 365. There's some features that are missing that I really that I was looking for. But at the same time, it was good enough that I totally understand why people use it every day and don't see a need to switch.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know that. So we were new to our Google Docs feature, and you were new to Google Docs itself, which is actually probably like the perfect combination for solving all these problems right away. Because from both ends, we didn't really know how it was going to work. And one of the things we were most excited about when we sort of decided to go ahead and build our Google Docs book writing workflow was the ability that authors would then have to use the collaboration features that Google Docs has. Did you use that in the iteration?
Oh yes, that's one of the things that was very helpful, but also I wish Google Docs did better, but that's what we did. So there's 26 chapters in the book. Not all of them are super long, but there's 26 chapters, which means there's 26 different documents. And what we did was use the Google version of Track Changes. And so Paul Thurrott edited the book. So he'd go through, read chapter 1, make all his edits, and then I would follow up and make the corrections or reject them as needed. And so, yeah, we use that heavily. And that's, again, one of the reasons why we went down that Google Docs route, was because it was supposed to have such a good collaborative experience for that editing process that I knew would be on the horizon.
My last question is, I mean, you've sent the 24 emails, but if there was one more thing we could fix for you or build for you, what would you ask us to do?
Oh, if there's one thing, there is one still minor bug, but I haven't quite figured out exactly how to replicate it. And as soon as I do, I'll send you guys an email. There's a bug with image location currently with the plugin. When you hit preview and then you export a file to PDF, it seems like the first time I do it on any given edit, the images are swapped, like they're out of place. But then if I do it the second time, it's perfect. So basically what I've gotten into the habit of is I just export it twice. The second one's always good. And then I just run with it. But other than that, there's not a whole lot. The only thing I could think of candidly is maybe better documentation on just how to use the plugin. Just because much like anybody else, I was just clicking stuff and dragging things. Like I didn't even realize for the longest time that you could drag the chapters around in that right rail. I was actually renaming files and dragging and copying and pasting content. But yeah, well, I had no idea. I was just like, okay, there's chapter 23 and there's chapter 26. Well, crap, I need to swap them. So I would just copy and paste the text into the right chapter rather than dragging it around. And then one day, I don't know if I accidentally clicked or whatever, I drug it. And I was like, oh, God, you can just drag chapters around. That's great. I wish I would have known this a month ago.
Thanks very much for that. We're actually going to be deploying a redesign of the author, what we call the author app, but the way you navigate around pages and do things. And, the next task is going to be making videos, and I will 100% make sure to show in the Google Docs workflow video that you can do that because, it's just so interesting to hear that you were doing that copying and pasting. I mean, it's exactly the kind of thing that I do with all kinds of products all the time. But, but it's also the kind of thing that that's the kind of thing that users don't often tell you about. So it's really great to know that we can, we've actually built a solution for a problem that people are finding ways to solve without, doing it the way that we've already built for them to do. The last thing I'm going to say is that this is totally out of order in the sense of sequence, but I wish I'd said this story earlier when you talked about being in college and trying to make money. By coincidence, we have a former colleague named Mike Rowe who got a little bit internet famous when he was a teenager because he created a little consulting company called Mike Rowe.
Wait, I know him. Well, I don't know him, but I know the story. Didn't he get sued by Microsoft for trying to... Or they approached him?
Yeah, he got in trouble, and then I don't know the exact story. It's actually on Wikipedia. And just for everyone listening, his name was Rowe, so Mike Rowe, and so he got Mike Rowe. So, and there's actually also another famous person named Mike Rowe. But anyway, yeah. So the story's on Wikipedia. I haven't read it in a while, but yeah, he got in some heat. But then Microsoft got in some reverse heat for going after just some Canadian teenager, and I think he got like an Xbox or something out of it. But I think he wishes he'd got more.
Oh man, that is that is nuts.
Yeah, that's just a funny coincidence. Thank you very much, Brad, for taking the time to do this interview. It was a really fun conversation, and thanks for taking the time to talk a little bit about your experience making a book and using LeanPub. And thanks for being a LeanPub.
Well, thank you. I mean, this was a lot of fun. Thanks.